Live from New York City, it's the Gary Null Show. And now, your host, Gary Null.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Null on the road filming. Today, we're going to talk in the second part of our program from Washington, D.C. with Chris McGreal. He is a foreign correspondent for The Guardian in the United Kingdom and now based in the United States. And we're going to talk about Big Pharma and the U.S. healthcare system's role in the creation of the opiate epidemic. It's long overdue. So we're going to have that conversation. And we're also going to give you the latest in health and healing, including new and surprising benefits from sunlight from Georgetown University's Medical Center. And we're going to hear a few minutes from some of the best clips of George Carlin. And also, if you believe that the Donald is getting his comeuppance with the Mueller probe and some of the people that were affiliated with him have been found guilty, we're going to share a different perspective. This is from a former U.S. attorney for the, for the District of Washington, D.C., Joe DeGenevo, and he has a different perspective. I then decided to look at the actual legal arguments for and against what's been happening. And it's disturbing, and I'll share that perspective of my own and open it up if we have time for your insights as well. So we have a lot to share today. We begin with health. Sunlight allows us to make vitamin D in our skin, and that's credited with living a longer and healthier life. But new surprising research reveals there's another wonderful benefit to getting some sunlight. According to Georgetown University Medical Center researchers, they have found that sunlight, through a mechanism separate than vitamin D production, energizes T cells that play a central role in human immunity. Their findings are published in the peer-reviewed journal Scientific Reports, and it suggests how the skin, the body's largest organ, stays alert to many microbes that can rest there. And then the sunlight and the skin start to work together to enhance our immunity. So if you have any viral infection, that could help benefit the body in lowering those viral loads. That's important. And by the way, I've asked recently for an upcoming health support group I'm going to do, what would be the topics you would like to see addressed? For example, I had a whole year meeting every week, 52 times, a group of 500 women, and I think it was 55 men, going through menopause for the women, andropause for the men. At the end of that time, the results were so important that virtually all menopausal symptoms were reversed. And in fact, 5 women who were postmenopausal, the oldest being 8 years postmenopausal, became premenopausal. Hair started growing back thicker, skin plumped out, lips began to form again, the eyebrows thickened in instead of thinning, weight came down, the metabolism increased, energy increased, sleep and quality of sleep increased, pain went down substantially, fatigue was eliminated, hot flashes and night sweats gone. So an awful lot of good happened from that, and it was published and in a journal, and then I was invited to a scientific conference to present that information. That's normally what happens. I've done about 41 of those studies, so I'm going to do my next one. And the length of the study will depend upon what we're trying to achieve, because I've created some new protocols. So I'm asking the people in the audience, what are you interested in? Only give me 2 topics, that's it. And then I'm going to look at all the topics and just select the 2 most commonly requested topics. Now, how can you put a request in to be a part of this study? Simply go to prnstudio@gmail.com. prn studio@gmail.com, and write down just two. If it's overcoming fatigue or overcoming pain, that's all you have to do. And then I'll announce in the next couple of weeks what topic we're taking on, and you'll have brand new protocols, and we'll be able to help people. In this one, you don't have to attend in person to be there. Therefore, people all over the world can attend. I'm going to be doing it as a video conferencing so that no matter where you're at, you can be a part of it. Now, the joy of giving lasts longer than the joy of getting. This is according to University of Chicago Business School, and this was published in Psychological Science, the Journal of the Association of Psychological Science. The happiness that we feel, and we've all felt this when we do something good, not to get a reward or a thank you, but because it simply is who we are, to think about doing the right thing instead of waiting for someone else to do it, or being too busy, or thinking it's not our responsibility. And what was found is that the happiness we feel after a particular event or activity diminishes each time we experience that event, a phenomenon known as hedonic adaptation. But giving to others may be the exception to this rule. In two studies, psychology researchers at the University of Chicago Booth School and at Northwestern University's Kellogg School found that participants' happiness did not decline, or decline much slower, if they repeatedly bestowed gifts of some kind. A gift doesn't have to be something physical, it be emotional, on others versus repeatedly receiving those gifts themselves. So, now think of it in this way. How many people have you known in your life who have a sense of emotional entitlement? They feel that in every conversation, in every word spoken, in every intonation of your energy that you share with them, in every glance of an eye, it should be to make them feel good about themselves. And what happens when someone doesn't get what they want? They generally lash out. They become highly accusatory. You're either insensitive or cold or selfish, no matter what you've given. And what's interesting is there's never an accumulation of appreciation. For example, how many times have you done things for people that they could have done for themselves? Let's say a parent taking their teenager or young adults laundry and doing it. They could have done that themselves. Going shopping all the time. They could have helped. They could have done that. Cleaning up, making a meal. They could have also done that. And then once you don't do it, there's no appreciation for all the times you have sacrificed your time and energy and money to do it. Or it's always about you making someone feel good, as if they're a sponge, fill it up with emotion. And so this science is showing that when you give to other people, that nature of giving to other people allows you to feel good about yourself. Now, people may appreciate what you're doing for them or not. But even if they don't, just the idea that you're doing something to make a difference. I'll give you an idea. For those of you who live in the New York area, all 5 boroughs are loaded with homeless people. In the daytime, you don't always see them because in the morning, the police go around each of the neighbors. I know this for a fact because I've actually seen them do it, and I've spoken with both the people it's being done to and with the police. And they say, you got to get out of the park, meaning in this case, Riverside Park, where a lot of homeless people go, and by 7 o'clock. Why 7 o'clock? Because that's when the people from the Upper West Side go out and do their biking down by the river or run down there or take their dogs out, and they don't want to be distressed by seeing a homeless person. Somehow it takes away from their their perception of what it means to be a resident on the Upper West Side. If I'm paying this much for an apartment, and I don't want to have anything, be in my view that I'm not happy with. That's the general rule. In fact, there's a very significant person at Lincoln Center. And as I'm running, I heard someone say, "Hi, Gary," and I turned around. There's a gentleman sitting there. So I walk over and I said, "Hi, what's your name?" And he told me his name. And he said, "I've seen you a lot," and da-da-da, and saw you on PBS many times. And I asked him, what are you out here for? He said, "Every morning I come out here. I like to come out and read the New York Times before I go to work." "Oh, where do you work?" He told me. And when I tell you it's very significant, this is a policymaker. And I said, "I got a question for you. Every morning I see, because I come out very early, I see when it's dark, a long line of people standing in front of the water fountain down by the river. And they've got a toothbrush and they're washing, and no matter how cold it is. And then they get ready and they go about their day. And when I talk to them, they say the police come and say they got to be out of there. And so they go out. And I felt sorry for them because a lot of these people don't have any place to go. Most of them are from another country, South America. And I said, "Do you notice?" He said, "Oh, yeah." He says, "Yeah." He says, "Unfortunately, it's unfortunate." He said, "We could be doing a lot to help these people. We do nothing because the people on the Upper West Side don't want to be reminded that they're poor people living in a very expensive neighborhood. Somehow it takes down the panache of what they spend all that money for." And I said, "But aren't these supposed to be more liberal, more humanistic, less materialistic, less selfish, more spiritual?" He's, "Yeah." He's, "Yeah, and there are other illusions to life as well." And that was how the conversation ended. And no matter who I speak with, you see this. So imagine that each day you just took a little extra money, whatever you can afford. Let's say it's $50, and it could be more or less. And as you're going on your run or bike, you see a homeless person. And you see that they spent the night in a cardboard box with paper under their clothes to help insulate somewhat, and whatever they can wear. Giving them $10. It takes nothing away from you. You're never less for doing more for another human being. And you're never more for doing less. So it won't change the person's life, but in that day, you're allowing yourself to acknowledge that there is a connection between you and that other person. They're not just a homeless person that you're going to run by or walk by or be angry they're there or non-pulse by it. You're going to say, that's a human being. That's a sentient being, just like myself. At this moment, I'm just in a little more, and I'm in a better position. I'm more fortunate than that person. But who knows? I could be in that position too. So helping that person, saying, "Hey, friend, can I buy you a breakfast?" Well, imagine how surprised they're going to be. So you take them up and you buy them a breakfast, whatever they want to eat. You buy it. How much does it cost? $10, $12 maximum. Now you've done something. Now just take that to any part of America where you can extend your kindness to another person. And that study is showing you're going to feel better about yourself. You're going to feel that you did the right thing. And that's why part of us feels bad when we see something we could have done and we didn't. And yet how much energy do we give people who don't appreciate a damn thing we do for them? They just expect it. And they didn't deserve it. And yet the people who we don't know frequently would be more appreciative of anything we did for them. So that's part of what this study had to say. Separately, for those of you who are having trouble sleeping, I found two good studies. And one was published in Manera Medica, and it was a very important peer-reviewed study that showed that the French oak wood extract enhances sleep quality and insomnia. Again, French, 2 words, oak, O-A-K, wood, W-O-O-D, extract. Generally, these are liquid extracts. And this was a quality, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. And they found that they were evaluating insomnia, fatigue, mood fluctuations, and oxidative stress using a combination of different scoring scales. And on the most important insomnia scale and fatigue severity scale and the brief mood introspection scale, it made a difference. For example, people who took the French oak wood extract had better quality of sleep, less grogginess, and less fatigue. And also, along with other health implications such as high blood pressure and depression. So things that we're not using, that we should and could, can make a difference. But there's a separate study. This is from Johns Hopkins University. And there they used a bark of a tree, a beautiful tree, by the way, the magnolia tree. Magnolia trees are all over the southeastern United States, and they're just gorgeous white giant blooms that come out. And in this study, the magnolia, which is the Magnolia officinalis, is a flowering tree whose bark and flowers are commonly used in traditional Japanese, Korean, and Chinese medicines. However, most people today are not that familiar with the herb, which is very unfortunate since it is associated with a wide variety of health benefits. And one of the most common uses of magnolia bark is to promote sleep and relaxation in highly stressed people. Now, why does this work? Well, it's relatively straightforward. It's biochemical. The bark of the magnolia tree is rich in bioactive compounds such as magnolol and a honochiol. Now, these are anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, anti-allergy properties. And it also has capacity to be very soporific. So it promotes relaxation and it promotes good night's sleep. Also, magnolia bark can boost the production of gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA. Now, that's a brain chemical that includes a calming effect on the brain. So by increasing the amount of this neurotransmitter, you can effectively prevent insomnia, which is a sleep disorder associated with low GABA levels. And adrenaline and cortisol are some of the other substances in the body that are affected by magnolia bark intake, because you don't want those elevated. Adrenaline rushes and come from being excited and angry and fearful and highly stressed. And cortisol is a main stressor, and those also create insomnia. And magnolia bark contains at least one compound that increases the amount of time a person spends in rapid eye movement and non-rapid eye sleep, which are also known as active and quiet sleep, respectively. And it's important to undergo these two phases since they have distinct contributions to sleep. So according to a study published in the journal Neuroscientist, the NREA-M phase is when the recovery of cells occurs. Meanwhile, the same article said that REM, rapid eye movement sleep, allows for the selection of cells that are already in top shape, since they don't have to be fixed in the subsequent NREM phase. In any case, just another thing that can help us a big time. And finally, from Tel Aviv University, which is in Israel, they found a popular food supplement that you know about, but they just discovered can be instrumental in reversing the detrimental effects of familial, what is called a dysautonomia, or FD. That's a debilitating neurodegenerative disorder that affects approximately 1 in 31 Jewish people of Eastern European or a Ashkenazi ancestry. And FD affects aspects of the autonomic nervous system, such as swallowing and sweating and pain sensitivity, and places patients at increased risk of pulmonary and gastrointestinal complications. So we have a lot of Orthodox Jewish people listening to this radio show, and we welcome you every day. And I've lectured many times within the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox community because there's a lot of people interested in their health. This article, by the way, was published in PLOS Genetics. So let me explain this to them because you should pass this information on. That nutrient that they're at Tel Aviv University that they're so excited by is one that we talk about all the time, phosphatidylserine. Let me spell it. I'll spell it slowly so you can write it down. You can use the initials PS, but you can PHOS, PH, a title, ATIDYL, serine, SERINE, phosphatidylserine. That will help with FD. That's very important. You see, neurons are the longest cells in our body. And the highways along our neurons allow, let's say, a cargo to supply our neurons with essential supplies. And in most neurodegenerative diseases, these highways, called microtubules, and the anaxal transport process are impacted. So the study that was done under Professor Ast at the Tel Aviv University found all this out. So, they found that in neurons from an FD mice, the microtubular highways are impaired by elevated levels of an enzyme called HDA-C6, and this impairment removed the adhesion that connects the bricks of the highway, and this led to less stabilized highways and to the slower movement of the cargo along it, according to the authors of the study. So take, I would say, 200 milligrams of phosphatidylserine per day in the morning and 200 in the evening. And that can help repair the activity of these neurons from the FD by reducing the amount of an enzyme that removes the so-called glue from the bricks. Something to help the people in this audience. And by the way, finally, I filmed Professor T. Colin Campbell recently for a major film. And his center, the Center for Nutritional Sciences, had a study involving 188 countries worldwide, and they assessed the effects of 79 different factors on death and disability. And this was a big study. And what they found was this: a plant-based diet can help you live a longer life. It's that simple. No matter where you go in the world, this was a true statement. Now, we've discussed many times why a whole food plant-based diet is so beneficial to our longevity and preventing disease and reversing disease we have. That means, all the good, wholesome fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, and getting rid of the red meat and the processed meats and refined carbohydrates and processed sugars. We can reduce our risk of heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, and that turns off inflammation in the body, and that turning off the inflammation allows our cells to live longer. So that's what their study found, and those that adhered to the strongest plant-based diet, which in the whole world were the Okinawans, because, get this, the traditional diet in Okinawa is 96% plant-based. But the Okinawans are not the longest-lived population in the world. That honor goes to the Californian Seventh-day Adventists, specifically the vegan Seventh-day Adventists, California. So they have the longest life expectancy in the world. But the average American, you're way, way, way down the scale. You're actually living shorter lives now. And the millennial generation and the X generation, you're dying much faster also. Oh, one last thing. From Tiradentes University in Brazil, pomegranates have strong anti-tumor effects. So, one more reason to eat your pomegranates, or have the pomegranate juice, or the pomegranate concentrate. So, because they're good against cancer, and there are a lot of good studies proving that. So, pomegranate a day can help keep cancer away. One extra last thing, because I was thinking about this, because this morning I was counseling someone who was morbidly obese, and they were, because they had no immediate pain and were not taking any medications, they were under the assumption that somehow being overweight was not a problem. Please listen to what I'm going to say. It is not humanly possible to be overweight and healthy. You may not observe the methylation process or the let's say the process at the cellular level where oxidative stress is occurring, the extra burden upon the heart. You cannot see nor know your homocysteine levels, which are indicators of having a heart attack or stroke or cancer, or from fibrinogen, triglycerides. These are all silent markers. And you can't tell how damaged your artery is and the epithelial tissue is, and you don't know how much lubrication your joints have. None of these are known. So the fact that you have yet to experience a complication of being overweight doesn't mean you're not going to and aren't. This is the latest to add to that. This is from the Helmholtz Zentrum Musen in Germany. The extra pounds, quote, you gain during the holidays will not only show up on the hips, but will also affect your DNA. This is the result of a large-scale international study coordinated by the Institute and partnered with the German Center for Diabetes Research, which is now published in the most respected journal in the world, Nature. The study shows that a high BMI, which is your body mass index, leads to epigenetic changes at nearly 200 places within the genome, which affects gene expression. And while our genes do not change in the course of life, our lifestyle will directly influence the surroundings and hence will impact the genes. So scientists speak here about the epigenetic, the Greek epi, over and outside of and around, which refers to everything that happens on or around our genes. So up to now, there's not been much reason to attach the epigenome being altered as a result of being overweight. Now it is. So they just did this, and this is based on the world's largest study of body mass index and epigenetics. So when you're overweight, your genes are changing because you're overweight. And that is going to shorten your lifespan. I'm Gary Null. We are 28 minutes into our program. We're going to take a break. We're going to go to our guest in a moment who's standing by. And before we go to our guest, who's down in Washington, D.C., Chris McGreal, talking about Big Pharma and the health care system's role in creation of the opiate epidemic, I just want to share a thought and see if this resonates with you. And it's about what we do in the name of peace, freedom, and democracy, no matter how noble the intent or how manipulative the intent, because the people in power are never going to tell you all of their true motives. they have a lot of public relations apparatus at their disposal to try to sell you. They sold us into Vietnam, and they sold us into Korea, and they sold us into Afghanistan, and Iraq, and Libya, and Syria, etc. But what happens when that conflict is over, or we've withdrawn our interest and the media is no longer focused on it? Do we ever go into these countries and say, are you better now because we were here? No, we don't. Right now, in Libya, for example, it became the world's largest outdoor slave market. And now the newest thing is organs. So people are being brought into Libya, those who want to escape the poverty or civil war in their own country and want to get to Europe. And it's one of the places they can get a boat out. And before they get on that boat, frequently, if they're young and healthy, they are taken and their organs taken. That's the newest thing. Now forget everything else. It's just, why don't we focus on that and hold those who are accountable to get us into these messes? Then this article, it's a little article, it's Iraq, the Slums of Mesopotamia. It's only a page long. I'm going to quote it. It has become obvious that corruption has settled in Iraq since its occupation in 2003. Corruption has multiplied and engulfed all aspects of life. The emergence of slums in the land of Mesopotamia is but one of the manifestations of the disastrous consequences of occupation and the bottomless corruption of the successive administrations in Iraq. It joins phenomena such as hunger, unemployment, and poverty to depict a depressing picture of what has befallen this vulnerable country. It is a painful paradox that in the past or post-2003 period, we find Iraqi civilians and citizens who have become homeless, living like wild animals in the open, while historically Mesopotamia was the perfect haven for humans. Dozens of slums have mushroomed on the outskirts of Baghdad and other cities in Iraq. They emerged from poverty and lack of the most basic amenities. There's no water, no electricity, no sewage, no services. Children in these slums are deprived of education and of life. Most of them got a measly daily income or a meager meal by rummaging through garbage. Data collected by the Iraqi Minister of Planning in cooperation with the UN Human Settlements Program last year showed that about 13% of the entire population of Iraq lives in slums now in abject dire poverty. This percentage is conceivably below the truth because the census dispute include the population of 3 provinces and skip the provinces of Anbar and other cities due to the unstable security situations. The ministry's data indicated that there are 3,679 slum communities in 12 governments with about 8 million population. Baghdad leads the list with 1,000 slums, followed by the Basra, with about 3 million inhabitants and 700 slums, and other slums account for the remainder. And it says that in just what you have is you have 3.3 million people living in 522,000 housing units, and these people have no services, no future, no hope. So I read that to you simply because of the hundreds of billions of dollars the United States and its allies spent in Iraq, and all with the certainty that it would be better because of us. So obviously someone's not talking with the millions of people who once had homes and jobs and lives, who now live in abject poverty. And that seems to be the case about every place you go. Just something to think about. Let's go over and say hello to my guest now, and he is the foreign correspondent for The Guardian in the United Kingdom, now based in the United States. And over the years, he has covered Africa widely and Israel and the Middle East from Jerusalem, where he was a correspondent covering the Second Palestinian Uprising. Chris has covered the Angolan Civil War, the invasion of Zaire and Nigeria's military rule, and the political violence of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and won the Amnesty International Award for his investigations into the organizations behind the Rwandan genocide. And he received the Martha Gelhorn Award for reporting from the Israeli-Palestinian territories. And his series on retracing the root of the grapes of wrath in America's modern economic depression earned the print feature story of the year by the Foreign Press Association. His recent book is American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in Three Acts, and it's perhaps the most comprehensive portrait of the opiate epidemic ravaging communities, and it exposes how the pharmaceutical industry's corruption has hooked Americans on addictive drugs and co-opted the FDA. Nice to have you with us today, Chris.
Good afternoon.
Last year, the CDC reported that a record was set for opiate drug deaths, 70,000, and approximately 45% of those involved the drug phenol, which we will discuss a little later, but that was 13% increase from 2016. And there's a lot to this story behind the opiate epidemic ravaging the United States today, which goes back several decades. And I guess we could start with the two major benchmarks. First is the pharmaceutical firm Purdue Pharma's approval of the drug OxyContin in 1999, and then the founding of Williamson Wellness Clinic in a small town in West Virginia in the 1990s by a former undertaker and prostitution pimp. So pick up there, if you would please, and provide us with a summary of how this opiate epidemic evolved, and also what are some of the more important statistics of opiate prescriptions and deaths and profits to corporations and doctors that put this epidemic into a larger economic perspective. The forum is yours.
You get two things come together in the 1990s. One is a well-meaning but distorted effort by a group of doctors who want to see better treatment for chronic pain. And they believe that prescription opioids are the answer. At that point, opioids were really only being used to treat people who were dying of cancer. They were end-of-life care. And these doctors believed that actually their use could be widened quite considerably. And that was a well-meaning effort, but in pushing that effort, they felt they had to break down the stigma within the medical profession, what they got regarded as an unreasoned fear of addiction. And in doing that, these doctors distorted the case for the safety of these drugs. They played up quite small studies which purported to show that addiction really wasn't very high, the risk of addiction, and that wasn't true. And so you've got these doctors push this idea that these drugs are safe and effective for treatment of pain. And at the same time, the drug companies come along and see an opportunity, of course. And as you mentioned, the company that's at the forefront of that was Purdue Pharma, which had invented, for want of a better word, a drug, a very powerful opioid called OxyContin, which it claimed had two unique features. One is that it lasted a lot longer and therefore was more effective than other lower level pain pills, and that it was also safer. It was less likely, you were less likely to get addicted to it because of the way that it fed into your bloodstream, into your system. And neither of those claims were true, but the drug company took this and ran with it and marketed this pill to doctors directly, making these claims for it, and essentially working with the rest of the industry to pump up the idea and these doctors that there was a much greater need for opioid treatment of pain. It was able essentially to flood the United States with these drugs. But it began by targeting small communities that had a history of using pain relief, usually because, for instance, in southern West Virginia, you had areas where there was a lot of physical labor, demanding physical labor, down the mines or in logging, in factories. And people had long used some form of pain relief. There was a time when it had been moonshine. More recently, it had been marijuana, and then other forms of painkillers. And the drug companies, particularly Purdue Pharma, looked at the stats for where pain relief was already being used and thought those are the areas to target. And so it flooded those areas with these drugs early on, 20 years ago. And as you say, there were at the same time doctors, most doctors who were prescribing this genuinely believed that they were good for their patients. They thought they were doing the right thing because that's what they were being told. But there were those doctors who ultimately are responsible for quite a lot of the drugs that are eventually prescribed, who did it for purely profit. And one area you see that in is this town that you talked about, Williamson in Mingo County in West Virginia. It's a town of only about 3,000 people, but there was an undertaker, a former undertaker appropriately, called Henry Vinson, who sees an opportunity. He has just been released from prison for running a gay prostitution ring in Washington, D.C., and he returns back to Williamson, where he went to school, and he sets up a group of doctors in a warehouse to just prescribe these painkillers to anybody who wanted them in return for cash. It was a $150 cash payment, and they handed out the pills. And this pill mill ends up prescribing millions upon millions of pills from this tiny town. And those pills go far and wide across the United States as word spreads that you can essentially walk in the door, slap down $150 and get hundreds of prescriptions for hundreds of pills that become a currency in themselves in other parts of the country. So it's the very heart of a huge drug trafficking operation, in effect. And out of that, in that area, and others, you see other pill mills grow up. You see people becoming addicted on the basis of the prescriptions they're taking, and it spreads across the country. The Centers for Disease Control does a very interesting map, which begins with a little red dot in southern West Virginia, and you watch it spread from 1999 out across eastern Kentucky, southern Ohio, other bits of Appalachia, and up in places like Maine, New England. And then in the early 2000s, you see it rocket across the country. The red dots pop up everywhere. And that is the surge in prescribing of these drugs. Until by 2012, you have 250 million prescriptions for opioids being written every year, which is one for every adult in the country. And then by that point, the death toll is already running into the tens of thousands every year. And nobody really knows how many people have died from opioid overdoses, prescription opioid overdoses. But the official estimate at the moment is around 350,000 over the past 2 decades.
Chris, what has been the long-term social and cultural cost behind the drug epidemic the pharmaceutical industry has created? And, for example, America's foster care system is increasing beyond anything we could imagine, and a large reason for more children being tossed into foster care is due to the rise in parental drug addiction and incarceration for dealing, and of course the deaths of parents. And this is particularly the case of poor states like West Virginia, my home state, and Kentucky, which already have poor social welfare systems. What are some of the other larger social costs that you have encountered, and what are the main reasons for why the United States per capita is largest consumer of painkiller opiates by far over any other nation in the world?
I was really struck by what you're talking about. I'd worked in Africa in the 1990s, and I used to go to villages in Uganda where there was a missing generation because of AIDS, and you had the grandparents bringing up the grandchildren, and that you see that. I wouldn't want to overstate it, but you see that in, say, West Virginia, eastern Kentucky. You see children whose parents are either dead or simply incapable of looking after them because they're so addicted to opioids. And as you say, it's placed enormous pressure on communities and on the social service system in West Virginia, so much so that actually West Virginia is actually having to send children out of state to other places just to be able to have enough people to care for them. And we're talking about thousands of children every year now. And that is just one social cost. We talk in terms of the number of people that die because obviously that's the most striking figure. But there's probably 2 or 3 million people in this country who are addicted, and that has its own costs, even if they haven't died. They spend their time often and their money in pursuit of drugs. That's at the expense of their families. It's at the expense of their children. They're not spending time with their children. They're not spending their money on their children. It's at the expense of their communities. You see communities in West Virginia where they're affected by the fact that people can't get jobs because they can't pass a drug test, where the economics of drug addiction and of drug dealing has actually distorted the economies of small towns. If you go to Williamson again, actually the businesses that thrived in that town through the 2000s were the pharmacies because they were selling these pills. And you saw other businesses, its main street was dying in other ways, but you actually had new pharmacies popping up. And you can go to small towns in eastern Kentucky where pretty much the only businesses left doing well in town are pharmacies because of opioids. And so it has a hugely debilitating effect on these societies. It's not something that is easily overcome. It's a really long-term battle for these communities to fight. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question now.
Well, that's all right, because you just triggered a thought about Purdue Pharma. The creators of OxyContin marketed the painkiller, as you mentioned, under the belief, and doctors took it under the belief that it was less addictive and more effective because it would last longer than other opiate painkillers on the market. But when we consider for the moment how much revenue Purdue earned from this drug, $1 billion in 2000 and doubling to $2 billion 4 years later, the money incentive, as with other pharmaceutical drug blockbusters, is incentive enough to ignore and deny dangers that would hinder sales. So what I'm particularly interested in is the corruption at the detriment of the public that took place between Purdue, its scientists, the peer-reviewed medical literature, and ultimately our federal health agencies that have permitted a free-for-all of OxyContin and other opiate prescriptions to go unchecked for so long. And in what way have the drug companies become the enablers for illegal opiate use, including heroin and other street drugs?
Yes, one of the most striking things that when I began researching this book and I was talking to people in West Virginia, for instance, was to hear that it had begun in the 1990s, that people have been hooked on these drugs for 20 years sometimes. And you think, how is it that that can run on for so long? Where were the institutions that are supposed to protect Americans? Why weren't doctors ringing the alarm bells? And it turns out they were. There were doctors such as Jane Ballantyne, who was head of pain at Harvard Medical School and its associated hospital, Massachusetts General. And she was prescribing these drugs, and she saw what they were doing to her patients, that they weren't working particularly well, that they were always in pain, no matter how high the dosage. And often it reduced the quality of life in other ways because they were so dependent on these drugs. And she wrote a paper in 2003 in the New England Journal of Medicine laying all of this out. And she really thought it would cause people to, the profession, her own profession, the medical profession, to pause. And it would cause the FDA to pause and even the drug companies. And it didn't. And other doctors who gave the same warnings were also shocked that they weren't heard. And it was because of the power of the drug industry over essentially medical practice. I think one of the reasons that this is a largely uniquely American phenomenon is in other developed countries, medicine is essentially run by the medical profession. And in the United States, it's an industry. It's not a health service. And it's run by financial interests. Not just the drug companies, also the insurance companies, for instance. They decide medical practice, in effect. And what you see happen when the doctors ring the alarm bells is a couple of things. One is that the pharmaceutical companies quickly decide, rather than look at whether these drugs were good for their patients, rather than doing the clinical trials and the studies that they have avoided for 20 years now, they decided to change the conversation and say, that the people who became addicted, it was their own fault, that these were drug abusers, and to paint the victims actually as to blame the victims. And then to say, but look, there are tens of millions of Americans in pain who need these drugs, and we mustn't let innocent victims, innocent pain victims, lose their drugs because of these drug abusers. And it painted it as goodies and baddies, the drug industry did. And of course, often these people were one and the same. There were people who began on their prescriptions and then became addicted and started abusing the drugs because they needed more and more of them. And that was very much the path. The industry drove that path. And it was able to do that partly because it has so much power through its lobbying. It's spent $2.5 billion over the past decade lobbying Congress. But also because it, as I said, it helps to decide medical policy. And I'll give you a good example here, is that a movement arose to have pain recognized as the fifth vital sign in the United States, alongside, say, your blood pressure and your heart rate. Of course, with pain, you can't measure it. There's no machine you can use to measure pain. It's entirely subjective, and you can only ask the patient. But this idea was pushed forward, and the drug industry latched onto it and essentially financed what became a requirement by something called the Joint Commission, which licenses hospitals. And those licenses enable hospitals to get money from the federal government. And the idea was pushed through the Joint Commission that hospitals had to test everybody for pain as a fifth vital sign. And one of the things you see happen is that the drug companies, Purdue Pharma, says, look, we'll write the policy, we will write the manuals to train the doctors, and then give them to the Joint Commission, and then the Joint Commission can sell them to the hospitals and to the doctors and make money out of this. And so you end up with a financial relationship where Purdue Pharma is essentially writing the policy that promotes the prescribing of its own drugs. And the Joint Commission's making money out of enforcing this on hospitals. And the hospitals essentially were obliged to follow this policy, and doctors came under enormous pressure to do so. And also from the insurance companies, which saw it as a cheap and quick way to get patients in and out and deal with their pain, rather than more expensive things like long conversations about diet and exercise and stress, or sending them off for physical therapy. And that's one instance, and you see that industry influence everywhere in how the pain policy is guided. And then even when you see the Congress finally take this issue up, you see the drug industry frame it as, we mustn't deny pills to the people that really need them. And Congress essentially buys into that for a very long time.
Yeah, Chris, you've done a magnificent job here with your new book, American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts. My hope is people will read it. My hope is people will contact their legislators, and especially those who have not yet been influenced and purchased by the pharmaceutical industry, and demand that there be major investigations and complete overhaul of how we're dealing with pain in these clinics and these mandates. Thank you very much for your good work.
My pleasure.
From Washington, D.C., Chris McGreal, McGreal.
Me minus you is such a long